We are live, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my friend Ken Harbaugh. And Ken is a former naval aviator. He is the president of Valor Media. He is the producer of the number one rated Apple documentary, Against All Enemies. You can find that, download it, watch it on Apple TV. Ken is a veterans activist and advocate, a democracy advocate, and a democracy activist. Ken is part of the great fabric of America's civil society, where he has stood up for the country, taken the oath, flown off the deck of aircraft carriers, flown into harm's way, and has come home and has entered into another type of harm, which is as a leading voice in a great battle that's taking place as we speak all across the country between two forces that have long been in opposition in the United States, forces that oppose liberty and those that wish to expand it. And all through our history, there have been attempts and attacks against the Constitution of the United States. There have been no gentle periods in the American story. And so today, we live in a consequential time. And so it's a great privilege to be joined by Ken. We're going to talk about some of the activities that are taking place, the large veterans protest taking place on the 6th of June in Washington, D.C. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about all of the things that are happening, but we're going to start by talking about the Valor Network, and we're going to start by talking about a subject that's of real importance, something that has gone off the rails, and we'll talk about that. I think it's in the last 7 or so years, but it could be a little bit before that. But as we begin the conversation with Ken, we're coming up on a Memorial Day. And when we think about Memorial Day, we have to think about the generation of Americans that were sent to war in the 21st century. But before we do that, I want to talk about the generation that we remember as the greatest generation. And I've never liked the name, because I'll tell you what, and I think it's clear in this moment that we're going to have another great generation of Americans. And I think truly the greatest generation will be the one that makes it to the mountaintop that Martin Luther King saw, right? That completes the building of the city on a hill. The World War II generation stood up. They were measured. They were counted. They did incredible things. But if you grew up when we grew up, as a young man, I was born in the 1970s. There was an archetype of masculinity. And that archetype of masculinity has been utterly shattered in the last 7 years by people who would have been routinely regarded by those guys as, there's a word, it starts with P, right? It's the P word, right? Which I can't say, which is too bad because it's an important concept, right, in society. And it was something as a young man you were raised not to be. And so when you look at an Andrew Tate, he's let's call him a pussycat, right? When you look at a Joe Rogan, right, another pussycat, right? So if you're sitting there and you're a person who has an audience of many tens of millions, and you're sitting there and you're like, Hitler and Kanye West may have a point here about the Jews controlling everything, or you tolerate the Nazi apologist, or you wink and nod at the racist or the misogynist, or whatever indecency. Doesn't make you tough. It makes you either a racist and an imbecile, and those two things typically match together like round square, round peg. And so those guys, by and large, would have been repulsed by the Andrew Tates, by the Joe Rogans, by all of these dishonest snake oil salespeople selling this fake gospel of machismo because the real thing is collapsed. And so real men, right, are not cruel, right? Real men are fierce against cruelty.
Yep.
That toughness is not meanness, and that there's nothing wrong if you're a man in standing up for the little guy. And so what these people are classical bullies who've said to be a man is to be a bully, and that's not true. But traditional masculinity has been castigated, run down, kicked into the gutter, been politicized, called toxic. And the truth of the matter is we need to raise our young men to be fierce in their patriotism, in their respect for other people, for dissent, for America's values. And we've done a terrible job as a generation of doing that. And so we've created a vacuum where some of the worst people you can conceivably imagine now hold themselves up as totems of manliness when in fact they're epic cowards. All of them. They're moral cowards, they're physical cowards, and they're political cowards. And you have a remedy for that, and that's Valor Media. And I'd love for you to talk about Valor Media. I think this is a great idea, a great network, and I think it's going to be something that really reaches tens of millions of young men in this country with a competing vision about what it means to be a man. And what it means to be a man at the end of the day is to stand up with some integrity. And integrity and manliness are deeply connected. And people who have no integrity, who are bullies and liars, have no claim to masculinity. And so I just want to get you to talk about Valor Media and your vision for it. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. It's great to talk to you. Your intro was overly generous. I'm a little embarrassed, but I think you hit the nail on the head when you described these influencers of the so-called manosphere as cowards. Because at the end of the day, every bully is a coward, right? They're projecting, they're compensating for something, and it really gets to me, especially as we're leading up to Memorial Day, when these guys invoke heroism, when they do the tough guy act, right? When they talk about the need to be strong on the world stage, and somehow every single one of them, the ones we're talking about, the Andrew Tates, the Joe Rogans, somehow managed to miss out on the longest wars in America's history, right? Iraq and Afghanistan. That shows you that they're all talk. On the other hand, at Valor Media, we've got a lineup of hosts that I think can reach into this toxic manosphere, this hostile information ecosystem. We've got 3 SEALs who are hosts on the network. We've got Rangers. We've got an ex-Delta Forces guy. We got 2 Navy pilots. One of them was a Top Gun guy. One of them was Pilot of the Year in PACAF, Pacific Air Force. These are actual dudes, right? I would love to put any one of them squared off with Joe Rogan or Andrew Tate and let people decide what real masculinity is looking at those examples. And it's what you laid out. Strength is actually found in compassion. Masculinity is found in taking care of the least among us. Being a man is not what you do for yourself, which is what is being sold, which is what Rogan and Tate and the others preach. Being a man is what you do for others. And I think there is a political component to this as well, because in failing to address this, we are ceding territory that we should rightly occupy. We gave up an entire demo of votes to Donald Trump because we didn't play in that information space. We didn't talk to them. We didn't give them a vision of what a well-run country can look like and what's in it for them. Valor Media is about uplifting the real men in our communities who we think can break into those information silos and save some of these young men who are being sucked into the Rogan and Andrew Tate pit of toxic masculinity.
I was listening to a podcast, and it was Scott Galloway, Professor Galloway, and Anthony Scaramucci, and they were talking about masculinity. And I think Scott Galloway is a brilliant guy, makes a lot of great points. And one of the things he's talking about is that you really have a generation of young men that are terrified to talk to a young woman. They just can't do it, right, face to face, have never asked anyone out. Anthony Scaramucci starts talking about, this rite of passage that, I remember well, which was this moment of terror, right? When you were trying to call a girl up on the phone and her dad might answer, right? And you're trying to sneak around the house tethered to the cord. You're fighting with your sister. When it was me, right? It was right at the advent of the age of call waiting, right? And you're going through these rituals. And we have young men in this country who were through COVID, not in school, miss out on this period of life. And then in the politics of the moment, our young men are told that you're dangerous, you're unworthy, you're somehow bad, that in any type of interaction with a woman, you're on the wrong side of that. Women don't lie. Young men are bad. And so in that space, right, this gospel of toxic masculinity, people talk about, the excesses of the woke era, right? People, young men, right? There's really no more Boy Scouts. There is a, absence of school. So we see the sports, right, fall apart. And in that vacuum, as the old saying goes, right, nature abhors a vacuum, right? There's fraudsters who rise up and say, hey, to the dispossessed, right, to the lonely, hey, follow me. And so this kid, right, and that's what we're talking about here, kid, right, is not sitting in a group, right, of 100 other kids watching Andrew Tate, right? This is not a group activity, right? This is a lonely activity. Yeah, you're sitting in your room, right? There is no girlfriend to talk to, right? There is no friends, right? So you have isolated, lonely boys sitting in their rooms, right? Sitting in their basements who are being stoked, being provoked, being fed a bunch of lies by these people. And it's metastasizing now in that you have a lot of these fighting clubs, a lot of these mixed martial arts facilities have merged with white nationalist politics and have become forums and venues for the spread, all of it connected through this manosphere, which is a fundamentally dangerous mix of extremists peddling a message that says, hey, young man, Winston Churchill's the bad guy and Adolf Hitler, well, he's misunderstood. And so, right, the remedy to this, right, is what you're talking about, which is that in the end, that the meaning of life and of manhood is the acceptance of this idea that there are some causes, some things that are bigger than yourself. And to me, foremost amongst all of those things that transcend everything is the United States. And so the United States is a project that's 250 years old. We're in our 250th anniversary year. Some great anniversaries this year. We had the anniversary of the United States Army, the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, all this year. And the Republic turns 250 next year, the birth of its independence. Thomas Paine talked about liberty, said you some things you can't put a price on them. He was also the first person to come up with the name, the United States of America, to write it down on a piece of paper and say it should be the name of the country. Against all enemies is a important phrase in the Constitution, in the oath that anybody takes to the Constitution. A lot of ways to serve the country, not just in the military. A lot of people have taken that oath, right, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Talk about your documentary on Apple that's number one, why you think it got to number one, and about specifically your use of that phrase.
Thanks, Steve. Well, I think it speaks to a lot of what you just laid out, which is a disinformation ecosystem that is so effective at reaching disaffected men, young men in particular. And our focus was on military veterans. I alluded to the longest wars in America's history, right? Those had repercussions off the battlefield. And we welcomed home actually 2 generations of soldiers back to the country, many of whom were looking to recapture that sense of camaraderie and purpose that they felt downrange. The vast majority, it has to be said, do reintegrate successfully into civilian life. But it doesn't take many. It doesn't take a small subset of that, a small percentage who find that sense of purpose and mission through the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys or the 3%ers. It doesn't take many of those to wreak absolute havoc. And the impetus for the film was me sitting in my driveway on January 6, 2021, just in disbelief at what was happening, in looking when I finally got my phone out. I first was listening to it on the radio, but I was watching the coverage and seeing the organized stacks, the tactical stacks or lines of people working their way through the crowds and realizing that's vets, right? And it turned out that a disproportionate number of the people there on January 6th, and certainly of the leaders behind it, the Stuart Rhodeses of this movement, had military backgrounds. And we wanted to understand how the heck we got to this point. And so much of it is because of this disinformation ecosystem that pumps lies into people 24/7. And if what you're hearing again and again and again, especially from the mouth of the commander-in-chief, is that an election was stolen, for example, and we have 100 examples of lies just as nefarious since then, but let's just focus on that one. You hear the election was stolen. At first, you don't believe it. You hear it again and again and again. You see Fox News playing on the Wardroom and the Wardroom TV on your base, right? You hear the commander-in-chief or the former commander-in-chief saying it, and it twists your mind. And you begin to tell yourself, especially if you're surrounded by people who are reinforcing this, that, you know what, my oath compels me to do something about it. And that, to me, is one of the greatest tragedies of how we lost so many veterans to this disinformation campaign. So many of them thought they were doing the right thing. And one of the things we try to get at in the film is the real onus of moral accountability. Sure, those who broke windows, those who broke into the Capitol deserve to be held accountable. I think the pardons are an outrage. But the real onus should lie with those who provoked, who knew better, the Josh Hawleys, the Ted Cruzes. And we just wanted to plant a flag, to set a marker for history that this is something we're not going to ignore, we're not going to turn away from. And I think that message is what resonated. It's what catapulted it to the top of the charts on Apple TV. It's now on Amazon, pretty much anywhere you get your streaming films. But I think that's what the film was speaking to, that struck a chord with so many Americans.
We have a generation of Americans that were sent to fight in wars that, one, was started under a false pretense by the administration that I worked in. I played a senior role in the Bush administration. I was a deputy assistant to the president. Against All Enemies is the name of the film. Everybody, I just saw that question. Against All Enemies, #1 on Apple. I was a deputy assistant to the president. I was counselor to the vice president. Again, the name of the film is Against All Enemies. Against All Enemies on Apple television. And I was a political staffer. I spent time in Iraq. Was sent there on an assignment, for a month or so, and got a taste of the flavor of what it is like to see the American military deployed fully alongside the British military and our coalition partners. You've either witnessed that, seen it, or have not. I'm convinced you could be in the military for 20 years and have not seen it and not understand what that is. It's an incredible thing to see. The power of the country. But what do you think about the political leadership that lost 2 wars, that your friends were sent to, that this is what politics is? And there is a reality that Trump rose in a Republican primary so many years ago as the truth teller, right, about these wars, in that, hey, this was crazy. We lost these wars, and hey, it's your fault politically. And so I understand at a psychological level that if you send the Army to war, and the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force and all of it, and all of the contractors for 20 years, and you lose those wars, and you lose those wars with the images, for example, at the end that come out of Afghanistan after 20 years, right, that there's a moral injury done, right, that's profound. And I'd love to hear you just talk about that moral injury, that grievance, that resentment that takes an American soldier, airman, Marine from defender of the Constitution to the tip of the spear, waging a war against it, prodded on by the exact type of person that at one point in their life they would have understood is exactly what the country's against.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the term moral injury. Most people aren't familiar with it. It is distinct from PTSD or post-traumatic stress, which most people do understand. But moral injury is an injury to the soul. And it's being increasingly researched and discovered that it can be every bit as devastating as PTSD. And it just leaves a hole in you. When, for example, you are sent downrange, you're told that you're defending the country. Say in Afghanistan, for example, you lose buddies based on this promise. And then you come home and you don't get the support that your country promised you. This isn't a hypothetical. It's happening right now. Look at the PACT Act, which was passed to take care of all of those soldiers downrange who were exposed to burn pits. It actually goes all the way back to the Vietnam War and those exposed to Agent Orange who were never taken care of. My dad was exposed to Agent Orange. We lost him a month ago. I'm actually wearing his jacket today. I took my patches off and put them on his jacket. But the first word in the PACT Act is promise. It's a promise to America's veterans. And it has been ripped away because the Republicans, at Donald Trump's encouragement, have taken away the $17 billion that was committed to take care of those veterans who shouldered the burden that Americans asked them to shoulder. On top of that, you have this talk of sending back Afghan refugees, many of whom stood alongside us in Afghanistan, risked their own lives, lost family members, interpreted, translated for us, fought alongside us in many cases. Those on TPS status in the U.S. are in danger of losing it and being sent back to Afghanistan because Marco Rubio's State Department has assessed that it's now stable. Do you know what happens to an Afghan interpreter for the Americans when he goes back to Taliban-controlled Afghanistan? Take a wild guess. That leaves an injury on the soul of the American troop whose life depended on that Afghan interpreter. That is what moral injury is. And this administration seems to have no regard for what it is doing to the American veteran.
I want everybody to understand what Ken is talking about. This is literally the plot of season 6 of The Handmaid's Tale, right? It is remarkable. And that decision, it's a bureaucratic evil that's being done. But I want to laser focus on something that Ken is talking about, which is that this is not Marco Rubio who is doing this, right? This is not Kristi Noem who is doing this, right? It's the American people who are doing this. When Marco Rubio issues an order, when Kristi Noem issues an order, right, that the burden of that is carried by us because we are a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And this is what instills in this moment, right, the fierce moral urgency, right, to stop it, right, and to say no. And so what I want everybody on here to appreciate is that Elon Musk is back in Texas, self-pitying, crying, right, saying no mas. And the truth of the matter is that 100 whatever days into this, today is, 4 months in a day, is that you have a lifetime of accountability ahead for a lot of people who've engaged in an assault and an arson and attack against the United States, against the law, across the board in this administration. And it's going to take a very, very, very long time for that to play out. It's easier to light something on fire than to rebuild it. And that's just the reality of things. But what we're talking about here, the moral injury sustained over 20 years' time, as we come into now a period where we're going to see something on June the 14th, which is I think a desecration on the anniversary of the birth of the U.S. Army. We'll see a brigade strength, about 6,000 American soldiers marching in a review, Kim Jong-un style, past our maximum leader, our Fuhrer, the American Fuhrer there, Donald Trump, tanks, fighter jets, helicopters, deeply un-American type parade. The United States Army is the greatest force for liberation in world history. You go to the American cemeteries in Europe, and what you appreciate there is what Colin Powell talked about, which is that the only territory the United States ever asked for was enough to bury our war dead on. And you can see that in France. You can see that in Belgium. these beautiful cemeteries. But how do you think about this June 14th parade? How should a veteran look at this? I think you have a lot of people in the country will look for the first time in their lives at a military review, not with pride as an American citizen with regard to the American military, but with some fear
Yeah.
of the power of it. So talk about that. What we're going to be seeing and how you're going to feel about it as a naval officer watching this play out.
Well, I think it's absolutely shameful. And we know what it really is. It's not a celebration of the Army's birthday. The Army doesn't want this. Nobody marching in that parade, I guarantee you, wants to do that. That's not what we're trained to do. We don't do pass in reviews in front of a dear leader like they do in North Korea. This is about Donald Trump puffing himself up. It happens to be on his birthday, right? I don't think that's a coincidence. He is seeing this as a birthday party for himself. The kid who sat alone at the lunch table now, right, has control of the most powerful military in the world, and he's going to make them bend the knee in full public view of the entire country. Steve, I loved what you said about accountability, because I think we need to be talking about that now for a couple reasons. The first is that it's just the right thing to do to record all of these outrages. Look, the parade isn't illegal, but plenty of other things this administration is doing. Plenty of other things are illegal. The renditions to El Salvador, right? The threats to end habeas corpus. The list goes on and on. I think we are lulled into complacency sometimes just because of how quickly these actions come, and we just move on to the next one. But by talking about accountability, we do a couple things. We show that we're paying attention. We are watching what the administration is doing. We're not going to forget. And it might actually serve as a deterrent, not to President Trump himself. I think he thinks he's going to be in power forever, or at least people who will protect him will be in power forever. But maybe the slightly less diluted mid-level functionaries will wonder if Democrats start running on an accountability agenda, maybe what they're doing isn't going to serve them in the long run. Maybe bending the knee to Donald Trump, pleasing the alpha in the White House, though it might feel good in the moment and it might elevate one's stature in the moment. If there's accountability, if we're talking about actually holding people accountable for breaking the law, then I think it might be one of the safeguards we've never had to rely on before. But I think it's a Madisonian observation, right? Liberty, at the end of the day, resides in the virtue of men. God help us, but I think we're at that point. We might actually have to depend on people and their character standing up to the president instead of the actual system safeguards and guardrails built into our democracy that he is demolishing with every new executive order.
So when you think about the U.S. military as an institution, and you think about Donald Trump's abuse of it, and you think about him potentially turning it loose on the American people in some type of domestic capacity, where do you look at the fault line being in the military, the tripwire that says, we're not going to do this? A lot of military officers say to me, well, what makes the military unique is the NCO Corps. And the NCO Corps of the U.S. military is not going to allow the U.S. military to be turned loose against the American people within the United States. And
well, look, we came closer than most people realize during Trump's first term. We came much closer than most people realized to seeing the 82nd Airborne deployed in Washington, D.C. with fixed bayonets pointed at American protesters. The only thing that stopped that was one man in uniform, Mark Milley, saying, "I'm not going to transmit the order to invoke the Insurrection Act." That, to me, is a signal of a systemic failure. It should not come down to a single military person in uniform as the final safeguard against a constitutional crisis like that. What scares me is that Donald Trump and the people around him have learned their lesson. They know not to have someone like Mark Milley in the way this time. And if you look at the people that they are putting in those positions of power that would act as a safeguard, that would act as a check and balance, I'm not convinced they would. The reason that Donald Trump chose the new chairman, whether the chairman actually said this, Donald Trump says he said it and is counting on it. General Kane said, "I will kill for you, sir," according to Donald Trump, right? That's what Donald Trump thinks the military's job is, to kill for him. I'm not making that up. Go look it up. That's what Donald Trump said General Kane said to him, wearing a MAGA hat, incidentally. That part is not disputed, him wearing a MAGA hat. So if we don't have that layer of defense anymore, do the NCOs or that mid-grade or junior officer, do they have the ability to act as the final safeguard? It would take an enormous amount of courage. I think it might be coming to this, but imagine the courage it would take to choose between your oath to the Constitution and an order from the commander-in-chief. That has rarely been tested in American military history, and more often than not, because we have such a bias towards following orders, the decision has gone the other way. In the military, you're conditioned to follow orders, and I worry that conditioning will not be conducive to disobeying the president.
Okay, so let's play this out.
Sure.
Just a bit, which is that if the 82nd Airborne had been deployed fixed bayonets to Washington, D.C., how long do you think that they would have stayed there?
That's a great question, but it wouldn't take long for there to be an instigating event, right? It wouldn't take long, like at Kent State. I don't know how long those guardsmen were there, but it wasn't days. It was an afternoon, and the day ended with 4 college kids dead.
So the 82nd Airborne is not National Guardsmen on an Ohio campus in 1970, right? So you have the United States Army's premier light infantry division, ready to go anywhere in the world, comes to Washington, D.C. in full combat kit as a occupying force?
I think if you look at the executive orders, if you look at the way they are testing, militarizing the border, and these other acts walking right up to the line of the Insurrection Act, I think the goal is to come up with a legal rationale for martial law. Should the country rise up? Should people say enough is enough? I don't know what the triggering event is going to be, but there are going to be mass protests against this administration. We're barely 100 days in, and you're already seeing the kind of thing that took years for other administrations to provoke. I think there's going to be something like that, and I think it is the Trump administration's hedge to go to martial law and deploy the 82nd Airborne as a show of force against the resistance, if you will, the protest movement that is inevitably going to rise up in response to the illegalities and unconstitutional acts of the Trump administration.
So there's an active force of about 1 million, and there's a reserve component of about 1 million on a continental country of 352 million people. So the 82nd Airborne full division, right, is going to be about 10,000 all in, and the 82nd Airborne doesn't have enough men to occupy Washington, D.C., right, let alone the eastern seaboard of the United States. So what does that, when you think about, right, the military, and the American military, right, until this moment has not been conceived of, right, as a martial force to be used as the president to constrain the dissent of the American people. But the American military, which is the deterrent force to aggression, all over the world, right? If it was all brought home, right, it doesn't have enough members, right, to be able to occupy the country. And we can see how, the United States did as a counterinsurgent force in Iraq, but right, where there were a lot less
Yeah.
guns and a lot less people with proficiency with weapons. But what my my question about this is that when you think about the avalanche, like coming down that slippery slope on this, right? And I think this is what's going to happen, right? It's that he's looking for pretexts. You
Yes.
see this with James Comey. The protests will rise over the summer. There will be some violent ignition somewhere, and there will be an unprecedented type of crackdown somewhere in the country that is deeply militarized. And I just at that point, where does the veterans community line up, shake out? Where do the people who are on the Valor Network, where do the mid-grade, the senior military officers speak out? Because, for instance, the most silent and capitulant group of people in this country in this moment are the retired four-star officer corps, right, of the United States military. Yeah. I mean, they're all on hedge funds, right? They're all, right, it's appalling. Right. Yeah. But how would something like that break? Like how do you envision the dialogue that goes on in the country?
Well, first of all, I agree with you 100% that the U.S. military can't occupy the U.S., but I don't think that would be the goal. The goal would be the kind of show of force to intimidate the opposition. You're already seeing that their willingness to do that with their attempts to intimidate people who speak out against them, grabbing people at the airport for having anti-Trump content on their cell phones, for example, threatening. I think it was Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, said Jim Comey should be in jail. Kash Patel and Dan Bongino are threatening to investigate him for threatening the president. I mean, that is using the levers of government power to intimidate and threaten the opposition. The military is the ultimate lever of government power. And I think what they are looking to do, they're laying the groundwork now, is use the military not to occupy the country, but to provoke the kind of demonstration of force that will cow the opposition. I think between now and then, we have to figure out an infrastructure, communications, policy, thresholds. We have to decide which red lines are triggers for us, and then be able to communicate to the people in the military that we have their backs should they make that horrible decision to have to abide their oaths in opposition to an unlawful order. That's happened very few times in military history. And I think we can anticipate it, and we need to tell that NCO, if you will, that we have his back.
Do you think it's important for there to be an advertising campaign that reaches the enlisted soldier outside of Fort Bragg, outside of Fort Benning, outside of Fort Campbell, outside of Fort Hood, right? That speaks to them as you took an oath to the Constitution, not a man. Is that illegal orders are illegal orders, and like following orders does not excuse you from accountability from an illegal order, and to start telling that story. Is that something that's necessary?
I think we have to find a way.
Done?
Yes, because in all of my training, and granted, I was an OCS guy, that's officer candidate school. I didn't go through the academy, but never once did I take a course on what to do in the event of an illegal order. I wasn't even asked to read the document that I swore allegiance to, the Constitution. Now, they do read it at the academy. They do read the Constitution in ROTC, but most enlisted programs don't make you understand the Constitution that you are pledging your life to. I think we need to have some kind of refresher on the obligation to disobey an illegal order. I don't think most people realize that it's not just you're not just given the right to disobey an illegal order, you are bound to disobey illegal orders. But the UCMJ talks almost exclusively about obeying orders and the consequences for not obeying orders. There is very little attention paid in military training, in the UCMJ, in military law, to disobeying illegal orders. And we have to address that, because I think that moment is coming.
Do you have faith in the military at a rank and file at a dangerous moment as they receive a legal order from this president?
I do, but I don't think our country should depend on gestures of faith, right? It is a roll of the dice at this point. I am 51% confident that our military will do the right thing in a moment of crisis. Would you bet the democracy on that? I'm not prepared to do that. And would you bet the democracy on the generals that Trump has now surrounded himself with telling him no? I'm not willing to do that. For now, I'll give the military the benefit of the doubt, but I do think we need to prepare for the worst, to prepare for the inevitability that Donald Trump is going to ask the military to do something unconstitutional.
Do you have a sense of the chaos in the Pentagon right now around the secretary's office? How bad is it?
It's bad. It's bad. I mean, the very fact that his own senior advisors are either fleeing or being fired. Look, I think the best anecdote is this separate signal group that he had that wasn't exposed by adding an Atlantic reporter to it. I think it had 12 people on it, including his brother and his wife. He was sharing the same highly, highly classified information on that signal chat, and 4 people leaked it. 4 people out of 12 leaked the existence of that chat to the media. That is the sign of an ill-disciplined senior Pentagon apparatus in absolute disarray, with no respect for the secretary. And look, I'm chuckling because I think Pete Hegseth deserves every bit of this humiliation, but it makes America less safe and it puts my buddies' lives in danger. So it's not funny.
So I think about Project 2029, which is the democracy restoration agenda. And so I think about fundamental ethics reform, and you think about the 100 things. I know the first thing. So at some level, I don't think Hamas won the $1 billion gift from Qatar is ever going to fly. That being said, let's pretend it did, right? Let's pretend it did. And let's pretend I was the chief of staff to the next president, right? At the moment of the inauguration, whatever airbase that landed at to bring Trump home would be seized, the plane. It would be on a Navy barge by 4 p.m., and it would be dropped by a crane off of Mar-a-Lago to become an artificial reef, right? Where the president's program for low-income children to learn diving off of Mar-a-Lago, right, would begin the next day on the reef, and we'd go from there, right? The cleanup exercise. So what do you do, right, in the Pentagon after 4 years of this insanity? What do you do? That now, and when you think about the military, this is true. I swear to God, this is true. There were more generals and admirals in Baghdad in 2007 than there were in Europe on VE Day, the day we won World War II, was with a 16 million person army, right? So when Pete Hegseth says, right, we gotta get rid of the generals, right? We got to get rid of like 20% of the generals, right? This is not a bad idea, right? This is like a broke clock being right twice a day, right? Your average major general is rolling like they're a Persian Raj, right, from the 17th century. And so all of these things are true. Like how do you clean this up? Right? What is the next Democratic president? So for example, right, I would say uh, under no circumstances, if I was a Democratic senator, would I vote for another retired four-star officer to be defense secretary. I would not vote for the waiver, right? Believe in civilian control, right? Whether it's the passage of a bill in the Congress, going back to some regular order, right? A restoration of how things are supposed to function and work, right? And how important that is. But where do you even start?
Look, I like some of that, right? I certainly like not passing another waiver and going back to normal order. And I really support the idea of accountability so that we can have some reckoning for the crimes being committed now, and so that we signal to those contemplating committing more of them that there will be consequences. What worries me most of all, though, is that this administration is acting like they'll be in power forever and that they don't have to worry about that kind of thing. And that, if you look at countries that have had that democratic backslide into autocracy, that is the flashing red light. That is the real warning, to borrow the name of your show, Steve. That is what we should really be focusing on. Why do they think they're going to get away with all this? Well, they think they're going to get away with all this because they'll never be held accountable, because either Trump or Trump's philosophy of governance will be in power forever. And that, to me, is the surest signal that something is on the verge of breaking in our democracy. I worry about that a ton. Look, we can fix the policy screw ups at the VA and the DOD in good time, but if we lose the democracy, all of those debates become moot. And that's what Valor Media is focusing on, countering the disinformation that is propping up an autocrat.
It is an amazing aspect of all this. I talked about this at length with Jake Auchincloss, who is a phenomenal member of Congress.
Good Marine.
Just talked about some of the things the Democrats need to do in Time Magazine. I think Jake Auchincloss should run for president. And I think he'd be a top tier presidential candidate. But we talked about the self-evident arrogance of all of these people who clearly do not believe that there will ever be a day where they don't hold the power that they hold, like Kristi Noem.
Yeah.
And it's incredible. Now, the truth is they're deluded, and none of them appear to be particularly that bright to me. And there is an arrogance that they are drunk on power, and there will be a restoration. There will be an accounting for the breaking of American law, for the assaults on the Constitution, and the excesses of this era. I have a question. I saw somebody had a Navy SEAL question. You're a Navy officer. You have a couple Navy SEALs on the show. What did the Navy SEAL say about the Navy SEAL dipshit caucus that has assembled in the United States Congress? Because, right, if you were to judge the Navy SEALs in the Congress, right, against the unit, you'd say there's something really broken in the Navy SEALs. what's going on. And so I think that part of the issue, right, that we're dealing with is we've had a lot of fetishization of the military by a civilian population that's estranged from it, right? It's 1% served. So there was a time when, for example, there were a lot of television shows like a McHale's Navy, a MASH, right? Because serving in the military was a common experience and people share the absurdities of it, right? At some level, the comedic aspects of it. And right, I think you go to a baseball game, right? You have the pro forma veteran brought out on the field. Everyone claps, thanks you for your service, right? The first thing that I would stop, right, in a new administration, right, I'd call the NFL commissioner in if I was president. I'd say it's over. I say there will not be a fucking American service member appearing in one of your fucking stadiums in uniform ever again during my presidency. There's no flyovers, there's no jump ins, right? That jingoism is not patriotism. And these partnerships, right, have been a disaster, right? But when you look at the Navy SEALs, when you look at Orion Zinke, when you look at these guys in their service, what are the SEALs like on the Valor Network? There's got to be a divide, obviously, when you look at some of the pro-Trump, some of the MAGA veterans, right, that have been co-opted by all of this, right? And, all sorts of people that, have been virtuous and physically brave, but have been moral cowards in a moment where political courage has been required. How do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I definitely want to tackle that because I have thoughts, but a nod to your old boss, I believe it was John McCain, who called out the military buying these spots at NFL games, paying the NFL to applaud the veteran on the field, right? That wasn't a gesture of patriotism. That was a transaction. And I am with you 100%. That is not the kind of patriotism I subscribe to. When it comes to the SEAL community, look, I think a lot of that is cultivated. First of all, there is division even within the teams. I'm not going to speak as a SEAL, but I can speak as a Navy pilot. I can speak as a vet. It's a diverse community. There are conservatives and liberals. There are Republicans and Democrats. What the Republican Party has done really well is cultivate that SEAL brand and elevate those guys into positions of real leadership within the party. And they sometimes pick the worst of the worst, but SEALs are nothing if not ambitious and capable. So they have an ability to rise to the top in ways others don't. I will tell you, the SEALs on the Valor Media Network are embarrassed when these guys claim to speak for the community, when they claim to speak for the country, when they claim to speak about patriotism, because a lot of them are out for themselves. I think your other observation is really important here, that it turns out there isn't a direct correlation between physical courage and moral courage. And in this day and age, with the tests that our country is now facing, it is the moral variety that we are in desperate short supply of. And I think we need to elevate those moral leaders like Jake Auchincloss, who have the ability to speak truth to power and to stand up and fight a righteous moral cause that hopefully does not require the kind of physical courage they also demonstrated at one point in their lives.
I want to, as we come to the end of the hour, I want to give it to you to close out and talk about this coming Memorial Day, which is a difficult day, I know, for this generation of veterans who it's a day of remembered sacrifice, not a day where we are so far removed from. And before I do, though, I just want to share this story about a great American hero, a master sergeant named Roderick Edmonds from I think Knoxville, Tennessee, and he was 27 years old, prisoner of war during the Battle of the Bulge, and he was the ranking American out of 700 captured. There were no officers, and there were about approximately 300 Jews in the formation of prisoners. And the German SS Nazi colonel came out and demanded that Edmonds, who was at the head of the formation, turn over the Jewish prisoners, and he refused to do so. As the situation escalated, Sergeant Edmonds made the point that they were all Americans, and that he could shoot all of them. And when they asked for the Jews to identify themselves, all the men stepped forward. And so that story on that day is the type of story about loyalty and moral courage, and courage in uniform, courage in life does not always manifest itself right in the taking of a life, right, or in the battle, right, when life is at stake, right, in that kinetic moment. And so these moral choices are of the deepest importance, that everything that's happening in the country right now, that is happening in our name, right, is something we have to understand. I was joking around. The other day, and I truly don't understand why there's not a daily news conference event that the Democrats have that is able to communicate to the American people, that is able to meet Trump where he is and deal with the excess and the absurdity of it. But one of the things that if there was a news conference of that, and there was someone who was participating, I would counsel them to say, for example, after playing some videos of Trump, right, I would say one of the things that Donald talked about a great deal during the campaign was the most important threat facing America, which was Hannibal Lecter. We caught him. We got him. And I would have a guy wheeled out on a dolly, right, on strapped to it, right, with the straitjacket on in the Hannibal Lecter mask, and I'd say we got him, and I'd wheel him out, and I'd say everybody, I want everyone to understand this concept because we got Dr. Lecter, right, and he's the worst, and I want you to imagine, right, he's having a threesome dinner with Corey Lewandowski and Kristi Noem, right, it's all three of them together. Right, Dr. Lecter and Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski, and they're having the dinner. Dr. Lecter, before Kristi Noem can shoot him like her dog, right, and appreciate that she may want to, right, he's got to stand in front of a judge, right, because it's the United States, right? So he's got to be wheeled in front of a judge, and I don't know how else to say it to all of you good people, right? But that's just the way it is in America, right? And so these things that we're talking about, right, are not up for debate, right? Does Trump have the power to suspend habeas corpus? He does not, right? There is no civil war. There is no invasion. Venezuelan gangs are not invading the United States. What's happening in the United States is prices are going up, costs are going up, taxes are going up. Things are getting more expensive. Jobs are disappearing. There is no investment coming. It's all lies. It's all bullshit. It's all nonsense. None of it is true. There is no $5 trillion of investment coming from Saudi Arabia. What there's coming is a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, a lot of breaches of faith, a lot of breaches of agreement, right? So the young guy who risked his life and his family's life, the woman in Afghanistan who trusted in that American flag, right, and took the side of the United States for a better life. They're all being betrayed, right? That sick kid in Africa, the least of us, right, on the whole planet, rotting food on the shelves, right? That's caused by Marco Rubio. It's caused by Elon Musk. All of that is happening. All of it is happening right now. It's all being done in our name, every bit of it, and we have a moral obligation to stop it. So we have a day that we remember the sacrifices of a million Americans over the course of the history of the country who died in the uniform of the country in service to the nation, gave what Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion. There have only ever been 700 million Americans since the beginning of the country. That's less than the population of current day India and China, right? So that's it, right? Half of all Americans who've ever been alive are alive right now in this moment. And so we have this day where across the world, in Europe, American graves have faced west back across the Atlantic that they didn't cross. Those graves will be decorated with American flags and flowers. In American cemeteries that are overgrown in places like Vicksburg, Mississippi, that are forgotten, the Union dead on the hillside there, that aren't tended like those places in Europe. Of course, in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, where this generation of America's war dead, many are buried, but in the small towns across the country, your friends. How do you think about this day in this moment when everything that you raise your hand to defend is being contested by a force that seeks to co-opt those values while desecrating them? How do you process all of that?
Well, I'm processing it differently this year than I ever have because it feels different. Memorial Day this year is going to feel different. In the past, I usually wake up early before the sun's up. I head to the water. I sit by the water and I watch the sun come up. Sorry, Steve. And I think about my buddies. Memorial Day is about those who didn't come home, right? It's different than Veterans Day. Veterans Day is about us. Memorial Day is about them. And it is a somber day. And then I try to spend the rest of the day thinking about the good moments with them. And I'm not one of those, I don't begrudge this at all, but I'm not one of those who bristles at the happy Memorial Day. I think most of my buddies would want me to be happy on Memorial Day because it's what they fought for, right? I don't like it when it becomes a day about mattress sales and cookouts alone. That's why I spend that time in the morning thinking about them. But I do try to be happy and with my family on that day in honor of them. This Memorial Day, I'm going to be in Ukraine. I'm going to be delivering ambulances donated not by the American government, but by other governments to frontline units in Ukraine, because democracy is under threat. And what my buddies fought and in some cases died for is under threat. And I think the country as a whole is going to increasingly look to veterans to set the example for how you defend a democracy when the threat is from within. And it is a chilling thought, but I hope next Memorial Day, I am back to spending it with my family, thinking about better things.
Well, Ken, I can't thank you enough. Against All Enemies is the number one documentary on Apple. Against All Enemies. That's Ken Harbaugh. Find that. Ken is the president of Valor Media. And Valor Media, everybody, is important, right? And it's important to connect the young men in your life to it. Listen to those guys, not these guys. These guys are dipshits. Those guys aren't, right? And that's how you got to talk to the young men in your life. Keep them away from the dipshits, the Joe Rogans, the Andrew Tates, right? Each one of these dipshits has the potential to poison a young man who you love and is close to you. And they ought to have a Ken Harbaugh on one of their shows and see what happens. I doubt it will happen, but we ought to see what could happen if that was. But watch the documentary. subscribe to Valor Media, and remember this Memorial Day that the sacrifices that have been made are your burden and your obligation and your duty to preserve through good citizenship. And that's what that day is about. It's about memory. It's about gratitude, but it's also a summons and a call to the protection of the Republic. And so thank you all for taking the time in the middle of this Wednesday in May. As we get closer to June, 4 months and a day into the Trump presidency, we'll have a lot more to talk about over this historic period of time of American crisis. Thank you all, and good day to you.
Thank you, Steve.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning. I invite you to join this community where I promise to be honest, blunt, and direct about what is happening in this country. America is in crisis. Follow and subscribe to this channel and on Substack. Thank you.